make this. Okay, well, so I'm glad you're expert in this. You just tell me what to do, and I'll.
So right now I'm seeing your Google Meet screen, so you might need to swap the presenter view, possibly if you've got multiple screens going.
Switch it off. No, okay. Or you see, that's what you see from me.
Yeah.
That's what you see in this one. Yeah. I'll bring it up to full screen, right?
Okay, there we go.
Right. So up to this thing here, and then from this, full screen on this guy, window view, full screen. Right. There you go.
Excellent. Yeah. Take it away.
Okay. Got everybody there?
Yeah, I believe so.
Of course, they're all muted. So if anybody wants to unmute their thing, I'll say hello. But it's, do I unmute them or you unmute them, or how's that?
They can unmute themselves.
They can unmute themselves. Okay. Well, if anybody feels like saying hello, I'd be happy to hear if there's what people are up to in particular and how that might bear on CT. I've done that in the past when I've taught this course. But if people want me to just start on in and start talking, it'd be hard with less feedback. It'd be nice to see everybody, but I'll just start talking. What do you, okay, is that what I'm supposed to do? Just
sure. I mean, or, you know, we can go through one by one here if you'd like, and
sure.
People can give a bit of an introduction.
Just say hi.
Yeah. All right. So I'm just going to go down the list in order of what I see in the participant screen. Felicitas.
Yeah, sure. Hi. Yeah, my name is Felicitas. I'm a postdoc at the Gordon Center. I joined last December, and I'm working mainly on PET imaging, but using CT for quantification of the extracellular volume fraction, and mainly for cardiac application and different cardiac applications.
Excellent. Wow, I get an expert in the audience. Okay, I hope I can help you. Very good. Next, please. Do we got Jay now?
Sure. Yeah, so hi, my name is Jay Gupta. So I recently finished my undergrad in biomedical and electrical engineering from Duke, and I'm an assistant staff member at MIT Lincoln Laboratory now, where I apply deep learning methods primarily to ultrasound image analysis, but I'm in this course broadly to expand my knowledge of just general medical imaging modalities.
Very good, thank you. Well, that means I got a mixed audience now. I got expert in CT, and I'll get what counts as expert in imaging, but not CT necessarily. Okay, next, please. And that's, make sure I can see my screen right. Oh, we get some more.
Yep.
No.
I guess I can go. Hello, I'm Nina. I'm a senior studying nuclear science and engineering. And I'm just in this class because I'm interested in learning more about like nuclear medicine and nuclear imaging and specifically. So don't really have much of a background, but still interested in learning more.
Well, good. Well, that we get the rest of the mixed audience. So I'll be pitching to all three of you then. And myself, I'm also come from a physics background and originally high energy physicist, experimental high energy physicist. But I'll start running in here. And this is not going to be nuclear medicine. This is going to be transmission imaging. This is X-ray CT. So ready to go. Now I've got this thing with participants in front of my screen. I can bring that down where it's not quite so much in the way. Can everybody see my screen?
Yeah, we can see your screen.
Okay, so I'm going to go on here. We're online. Oh, come on. Oh, how do I advance my screen? Do you want to give me control to do that, or how do you want to do
you've got control. So basically, whatever you do on your screen, we'll see.
Okay, well, let's see. It's not advancing. What the hell's that? Sorry. That's weird. Okay, oh, because that was live on that. Oh, sorry about that. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, here's where I want it is now. 20 of 5, so I'm going to rip through this stuff pretty quick. I want to open up with introductions just so I can tell you what my perspective is on this subject matter, which is that of somebody who's built CT scanners and knows people who do it currently for a living. That's where I'm coming from. So I started off as experimentalist, became an engineer, a physicist. A brief history of CT, we can go through what CT has, how it became what it is now real quick. Then after that, we're going to start off talking about analytic reconstruction, which is the historical roots of what CT began with, and it's still at the core of a lot of what's going on in real life applications. Then we'll talk about X-ray physics and imaging chains, but then we'll talk a little bit about how you measure the performance of a CT scanner and in practice, quality assurance, and also in some more formal ways where you had an assessment of the quality of the reconstructed image that you're getting when you have a known truth object or otherwise. Next thing, X-ray detectors, what the conventional ones, we'll just go through what those are. Then we'll have some model-based reconstruction, which is only hit the main stage less than a decade ago and now is being lapped by deep learning. So it is building on it. There's been a huge, huge change recently with the extent of deep learning applications to CT. Made me have to remake a bunch of slides, and we'll talk about that just as quick as I get through it, which will be a little while because there's a lot of content in that. Next thing is dual energy and spectral CT, which is going to be when we're not counting individual photons, but you do have some energy information about the photons. Then we're going to have digital photon counting CT, which can include having energy information. And proton CT, we probably will not get to. The slides could be here. I presume we have a way to distribute these slides. So I think we'll just cut out when we get to the end of digital CT, proton CTs, stuff I worked on personally, and it's fun. It's outside the scope. Next thing. So CT has a huge clinical application in many forms. In 3 parts of the medical, both for radiology and for molecular imaging with PET-CT, and for radiation oncology. And in radiology, so radiation oncology and molecular imaging have where you have a multimodality going on. And the cone beam is sort of, from an instrument designer's point of view, sort of a lesser version of what you get with the big, solid, costly, high performance, high-end CT. And portable CTs is somewhere a little bit in the middle, but it's more like the real CT. I shouldn't say not real CT, but cone beam, perfectly good and making it better given what you have, living within the constraints of extra scatter, a little bit less good mechanics, less power, various things. You get what you pay for to some degree, or you're constrained at what you can offer given the cost that's going to be affordable for a particular application, what's appropriate. So you have the base technologies with extended number of directions has a huge clinical impact. Now, my personal background in this is I designed dual energy CT reconstruction pretty much, or I led the team and made a version of it, and had some ideas. We got some patents and that kind of stuff. So that's my friend and colleague Olaf Johnson from Photodiagnostic Systems, which is still around, still making CTs. Okay, I'm not there anymore, but they are going strong. They went through making security CTs. They've got some other stuff I'm going to show here on the next slide, which is, okay, so I've made CTs and PET CTs, portable PET CTs with those guys. And now I had as help for the fact that deep learning has arrived, and I'm not in the CT field right now. I'm in PET and also in instrumentation and photosensors and stuff like that, the detectors. This is Matt Tivnan, who went through started off at Northeastern, did his co-op at Photodiagnostic, and has and now is at Johns Hopkins doing basically biomedical engineering there with a really good CT group. And he recently came through and gave a nice talk at Photodiagnostic about how you could upgrade the photodiagnostic imaging chain to include deep learning stuff. So I thanked him for some of his slides. And so the idea is that I'll quote him there in the middle in the blue. With deep learning, you can take your existing hardware and get both better images than you're going to get from your classic analytic chain. And I'll say what that means here in a minute with help from his slides. And you get the quality of image reconstruction you can get from iterative reconstruction with a lot faster speed and even some better quality depending on the particular limits of what it is you're looking at. We'll get into all the details about that. But this is a recent development. The analytic reconstruction methods were around since the invention of CT. And the invention of CT came in the 1970s, and filter back projection was not far behind. And that was what was classically used. All these things are developed given your compute limitations of the time, and essentially they worked well enough, potentially with filtered back projection and the improvement of the devices to get to third generation in a hurry. Basically, third generation CTs were around within a decade of the first CTs, which they were single slice, but they were still third generation, which is basically what all the machines are now. Fourth generation is sort of exotic prototypes. The spiral and multi-slice CTs occurred in the 1990s, and you went from having single slices, which were a cross-section of a patient, to having volume imaging. And the things that allowed that were a combination of slip rings and lots of detectors doing multi-slice, they call it. So basically those two things combined to sort of introduce volume imaging at this kind of resolution and made CT the mainstay it is of diagnostic medicine. So, and that history goes on now to include our current situation where CT is a mainstay for COVID-19 treatments and diagnostic imaging. So, but I can't go into any medical details. I'm a physicist. I'm going to be talking about physics and detector design. I'm a detector designer. So for a CT scanner, you've got the following components illustrated here on a nice marketing slide from GE, where you have the source and the beam line. The X-ray source is a highly developed and expensive advanced technology. It continues to get better, but that is a lot of money and expertise going into making those things. And it's also the fact that you got to put it on something and spin it fast. So the mechanics for that also is a challenge, particularly when you're talking about the high-end machines where you try to freeze patient internal motion for something like cardiac. So that's your mechanics with this data transmission. The slip ring is no longer usually what you're going to have. You have an optical link or something similar, but it serves the same functional purpose. The detectors are going to be an array of individual sensing elements. We'll be talking about those in detail. Basically, your spatial resolution gets determined by the size of those individual elements, and you have a beam line from the X-ray source through collimation upstream and then collimation downstream before you hit the detector. So that's your optics for your beam line. That's pretty much the main components. We'll go into some of those as to what they do then functionally. So at the moment, here's where if you're GE and you're selling CT scanners, where are you making headway, or what are you selling as the frontier at the moment? And so dual energy, we'll go back to that later on here, but that's the capability to do dual energy is done different ways with different systems. GE system switches the voltage on the, it rapidly modulates the voltage on the X-ray source. Other methods used by some other vendors, they serve a similar purpose for having some information on the X-ray energy distribution without having individual X-ray photon counting stuff. So that's what they're referring to with the dual energy capabilities that are on the market currently. The other things they like to have is fast scintillators, so that you don't need to worry about having afterglow from the last time that there was, you were having the X-rays hitting this part of the ring as you aim the beam that's going around. There's a number of reasons why you like the speed for the detector. You like to spin fast so that you can freeze rotation. It's very important to minimize your patient dose. So that is something which has been impacted a lot with reconstruction. So one of the big goals for reconstruction is to support lower dose, and your measure of your performance of your system for CT has to be done in terms of at minimum dose. You want to have maximal performances defined for your clinical task at hand with minimal dose. So the other big development within less than a calendar year was a first deep learning CT image reconstruction. As we're going to see, that helps, and as we heard on that earlier slide, helps with the speed with which you can do your reconstruction. Also, it's a different quality of the reconstruction. We'll see what that's leading to. It's a many-fold complex impact that that's having. But this is the first clinical system. Well, they call it the first for reconstruction. The others are image to image. We'll talk about that in a minute. So when you're doing CT data acquisition, you make multi-slice fanograms. What does that mean? Well, you have a fan beam, right, which would just be a fraction of a circle, and then a parallel slices of that. So imagine a curved rectangular array on that inside. So where you see that blue triangle, that's a set of blue triangles going into the page. Now, what you see there illustrated is having two sources because that's GE. But each of them individually will make a sinogram. I presume you guys are already familiar with seeing sinograms. And so that's just your mapping from your radon transform, your cone beam transform from the source to the detector position, and then the detector moves and you get a new one. So you can represent your array of values. For each angular position, you read out an array of values. Then you rotate to the new position, read out there, and you're integrating the times in between. So that's how you get this series of frames, which is the form that your raw data takes. That's why your projection space data. Projection space data has corresponding image space data, which you're trying to produce an image from this projection space data, which is solving the inverse problem. So conventional CT data processing, this is one of our big three, we call it analytic reconstruction. You go from the data to the target, and you do that with basically filtered back projection or its descendants, where these are all approximate algorithms. And the approximate algorithms then lead to artifacts and differences between the data. And one of the assumptions of the data is also infinite statistics, very high signal noise. It's analytic algorithms don't do statistics. They resume noiseless data. They be exact for noiseless data. That's the idea. So any imperfections, it's great. It's a fast algorithm. That's what made CT become widespread, is the filter back projection algorithm and the fast Fourier transform. And they're still around. It's a very efficient computational calculation to do your radon transform, or the equivalent when you're doing multiple radon transform-like calculations for your CT transform or your cone beam transform, things of this nature. So artifacts arise when the measurement model does not match the data. Filter back projection model, which can also be included in an iterative, when you include a filter back projection in an iterative model, we call that sort of a hybrid, iterative hybrid. So that's not true iterative reconstruction. Well, it's not true iterative reconstruction. It's not model-based reconstruction. It's iterative, but it's a lesser thing. It's fast, though, still for its calculation. So these things all assume that you have infinite X-ray photon statistics with no Poisson noise. You have no source variation shot to shot. So it's, that's not the way real sources work. You'll see variation frame to frame as the source goes around, also in its mechanical position. So there's no electronics noise, no dynamic range limits in your data acquisition. There's no X-ray scatter, so scatter is a background. There's no detector crosstalk. There's no calibration errors. Completely linear response everywhere. It's got a monochromatic source, which means all the X-rays have the same energy, and you're having what's called Beer's law. We'll come back to that, where it's just a single exponential. That's not really the case. So that's an approximation which can give you artifacts, in this case of beam hardening artifacts. It's a point-like source with infinitesimal and pixels and voxels. So this is your geometry, both in the source of the image. Perfect circular source trajectory with uniform angle steps, again, approximations. No material outside the field of view, no patient motion. Now that's the special one. We'll come back to that guy. And no contrast variation during the image time, which is sort of related. So these are at a different level of challenge than the rest of them. These you could do on a phantom. These ones, that's something else. You need a fancy cell fan. So the next thing is the Beer-Lambert law, which is just exponential absorption. So when you get absorption for X-rays, what's actually happening is one of two things. You're going to get photo capture or Compton scattering. Compton scattering is scattering off an electron, and that is going to be scattering out of the beam. Photo captures are actually absorbing. Once the X-ray is absorbed by the entire atom, then you get a short-range electron out into the material, but it's absorption. Scattering out of the beam becomes defined as your absorption coefficient. You get your difference between your definition of your attenuation coefficient. So you need to watch out for scatters. So if you presume the clean out of scatter beam means that there is no scatter, fine. Then you're going to have your absorption coefficient here, but you still are stuck with the fact that if you have a polychromatic source, which you do, then you're going to have different radon transforms, as it were, for each one of these guys individually, each different spectral component. So spectral component by spectral component, you've got a very nice setup, but you end up having to have this approximation where you treat it as close to being monoenergetic. What's the average energy? And then you make this thing called the beam hardening correction, which is an approximation. So we have, as usual with analytic reconstruction, with this brute force inverting to first order on everything, it's going to then have artifacts. In this case, a beam hardening artifact, and it's going to have issues with quantitative accuracy. So you find that you can get around those things with model-based, as we'll come to in a moment. So your polychromatic source arises from the way that you make the X-rays, which the challenge with the X-ray source is all the power, because you're making a lot of X-rays. That's what you're trying to do, and traditionally, before you were dose conscious, yeah, you made it as powerful as you could. Makes for faster exams and whatnot. But okay, you still can use a hefty source, but it's let's just say that your source can easily melt the target if you don't design it right. So the challenge is having these spinning sources where the tungsten source then will move away, so as not to give it time for the heat to dissipate from the spot that you just hit, so it doesn't melt through the source. So while you're doing this, so all this is an advanced developed technology, all the collimation of beam line associated with the X-ray source, and it's a whole division of the Aura company in and of itself that will make the X-ray sources. So they consist of basically making an electron beam that's going to strike the target, tungsten target, and make this type of Bremsstrahlung with the spectrum. So it's got a few continuous, discrete lines, but mostly it's continuous continuum down to the endpoint energy, which is your voltage drop that you put across the tube. So that's, you can change where that is, and that's going to change the average of the beam energy, but it's not going to make it be monochromatic. It's not monochromatic. You can filter it. You have stuff upstream that you can put in the target along the beam line to get rid of some of the soft stuff so that you don't do as much patient surface dose and things like that. That's all part of your design. And you can also introduce additional materials into the beam line to do dual energy that way, which is actually what we did with our security machine. That's less used for the medical, but okay, there's a bunch of ways to get energy information if you're being sort of crude about it, not trying to do it event by event, and you might not necessarily have the highest contrast between different energies. There's lots of ways to do dual energy. But most machines don't do it at all. They just treat everything as if you had a average energy for every X-ray. This is approximations, right? So what you approximate patients as is made out of water of different densities. So in other words, your calculational model would be what the world would be like as a cartoon world, where that's what exists. You can have different densities, but everything has the same relative abundance of Compton scatters, which is electrons, to your photo capturers, but all the same material. If that was the case, then your beam hardening you would get from it, you could have a one-to-one map, which would go, and you see it for water, right? You calibrate it for water, you see everything else has the same beam hardening. which is what the attenuation would have been if it was monoenergetic, and what the attenuation was, because you took out the soft stuff first. So that's your beam hardening correction as you measure it in water. You apply it to everything as if everything is water or denser water. Okay, that's a patient made out of varying densities of water. Bones, the content of the materials is not included in the model. So artifacts, if you're not careful, or at least some quantitative misaccuracy, we'll get back to that. See, dual energy can be quantitatively accurate and be a principled reconstruction, whereas this analytic where you approximate a polychromatic beam as being monoenergetic, it can't. So conventional CT data processing, so this is an example of a practical chain. This is the chain they're using at PDSI. And this is indicative of what you find a ton of places, and is basically at the core of the traditional way of doing these things. So this is what you build your model-based or your deep learning on top of, is this old traditional way of doing things, which the error offset correction is basically just you have your offsets on your set of integrating ADCs, and then you have the error, which is your beam, measuring how much beam you got. Then you get a beam hardening correction. The ramp filter is just part of your filter back rejection. That is filtered back rejection. Then you filter it in every space, you're done. So there's not a lot there, which is great, because you don't want there to be a lot there, because you want to get it done in a hurry. In a security machine, you got to do, multiple frames per second, that kind of stuff. So in the medical machines, it's a big image with 512 by 12, 512 for each of the image slices, and you want that in a hurry. So that's why you started off with these analytic reconstruction things, and that's why analytic things are still the mainstay. Sometimes in this hybrid form, when you do a few iterations of analytic, which doesn't take much longer than analytic, but the more elaborate things with model-based will come to in a moment. Those can take a lot more time. And they came out of a different sort of instrumentation tradition from PET, which had smaller images. So you can have the computational capability to do it in PET before you really do it. We'll come back to model-based in a moment. But whatever you were doing for your reconstruction, you want to have quality control. You have to have quality control. You need to make sure that your machine is working right. And so the practical matter, you can have a phantom, and the phantom you have, there is a convention. Well, there's the ACR phantom. So everybody's going to use this here. It's required for your certification, everything else. So everything's built around this particular phantom, which was designed by a committee to capture the most important aspects of CT performance. And so these performance measures include, having quantitative accuracy, having smoothness of the image, having low noise in the image, having contrast recovery for high contrast objects of small size. That's another measure of your spatial resolution. So they're trying to do something reasonably close to your clinical tasks. Now, the images then are all converted to CT numbers. This is another traditional thing. Now, strictly speaking, the CT number, if you were being quantitatively accurate about it, it'd be CT number at a particular X-ray energy. But it's a measure of the sort of the historical sloppiness quantitatively that came from this business of there being a polychromatic spectrum that you're treating as if it was, so there's a huge approximations built in from the outset. It was not trying to be quantitatively accurate, but it was close. And it's just interesting aside, I should have caught it when we talked about the history. CT was originally invented as an adjunct to radiation therapy for radiation treatment planning. It was going to be your input for doing your calculations for how much, for what your beam was going to be doing. People were doing. So for that purpose, it's all okay. The CT number has been around since then. Hounsfield units, Hounsfield, the guy who we saw on that earlier slide. Okay, nowadays in 2020, you have additional measures of your imaging system performance. And if you have known truth, or if you're comparing, the noise power spectrum is your classic measure from your linear systems theory for signal to noise. So back when you had linear systems, like with filter back rejection, it had a direct, it still is defined the same way. It's not going to be a linear system anymore, but you still have this measure of performance as a function of spatial frequency or recovery. So that gets you to spatial resolution and your signal to noise at different spatial resolutions. Your peak signal to noise ratio tends to be things catching more, so your structural similarity index matrix. That one is, again, these are things that we're going to see more as we get into the reconstruction section. I just wanted to make the point that the measures that you do on the phantom traditionally and classically, bearing on especially the noise power spectrum, are a subset of the useful things when you're talking about your imaging performance and trying to assess whether you're in fact improving matters in a quantitative sense. We'll come back to that point. So the biggest challenge for your instrumentation in CT is cardiac. The reason why is because you need high spatial resolution, you need to freeze the motion, and you have potential for metal artifact. Metal artifact arises when one of the directions where you are having the beam go across the patient being imaged. Can you hear me still?
Yes.
Okay, good. Sorry, I'm having someone's phoning me on my. I have hearing aids both ears, so there's something going on my phone. I apologize. Thank you. So the idea is that you get metal artifacts when you have one of your lines of response. The measured X-ray flux goes to 0 or comparable with your electronic noise, and so that's FT filter back rejection and other Fourier-based methods that make streaks. So you're taking a logarithm to go from your ratio of transmitted to air shot, and basically if it goes to 0, that blows up. So metal artifact is classically one of the things that we're going to see that you're going to be improving on, first with iterative reconstruction, then with deep learning. So now the radiation dose people became much more sensitive to in the early 2000s. And so the idea was, since that time, you've had a significant reduction in the amount of dose that was being produced by CTs. See, the old analytic reconstruction was not dose efficient. You basically solved your problem by throwing dose at it. You got high signal to noise by having a really powerful tube and long scans and lots of dose. That's how you got a good image. You use lots of dose. So you'll see, so come back to that when we talk about what constitutes a good image. Well, the way they used to be when you use lots of dose. So, okay, we'll come back to that point. The methods that were developed were two current modulation is you have a pilot scan around the patient just to see more or less what's going to come up. And then you change how much beam current you're having depending on whether you're going through the thick part of the patient or the thin part of the patient as you go around. And that can save you some dose. Multi-slice helped going to from when you had single slice. That was really dose inefficient. So people got dose, it got better when you're imaging more, because if you were going to image that much volume, then you better be doing it on multi-slice. Iterative reconstruction and statistical helped, okay, for low, and deep learning looks like it's going to help even more by a lot. And so we'll see, come back to that. So the classic detector, and which you'll find well described in these two references, which talk about the new type of detector, which is photon counting. These are the non-photonic counting ones, but it describes in the classics. So you essentially have the X-ray photon interacts in the scintillator, which is a material which glows when X-ray is going to be photo captured. And it's typically a high Z material, which has a lot of photo capture going on. You also have enough thickness to it to have some good efficiency with the X-ray photons. And then you structure the scintillator, you break it up into little cells with septa between them and reflectors so that you have a pixelated array. Pixelated array of scintillator with photodiodes in each one of them. That's your classic detector for CT. And that is then going to produce electronic signals for the photodiodes. And this is basically another situation where you're throwing signal and noise at the problem. You basically have a big signal in terms of the total number of secondary electrons being produced with photodiodes. And you're not going to be seeing, it's not big enough to see them as individual X-rays, but you're not trying to do that. you have plenty of X-rays. So this whole thing just integrates the signal, noise, and all. But despite that, it is the case you can make a system which is effectively usually the residual number of X-rays that are making it through the patient, so that you're making your transmission measurement, are enough to where the errors on that can be small compared to electronic noise. It's only when you have a low residual flux, which can correspond to your low dose case when you turn the tube down intentionally, then you start to have issues. But if you're a higher signal noise, then your electronic noise becomes negligible, and this kind of a system is just fine. And this is what CT was built on. So the detector arrays look like this. You make you get higher spatial resolution if your crystals are smaller, okay? And you want to have a good optical design to collect a lot of signal. And again, you want to have good time structure for the signal. You want to have good collimation in your, which is they're going to be at the detector, and a nice monolithic block where you can build the whole thing and make it cheap. The other things that you can make advances on is the scintillator, again, the speed of the scintillator, the cost of the scintillator. So people develop on that. You can continue to develop the sensors a little bit where you're integrating it, which is nice. Your ADC, your readout with the photosensors, that's one particular vendor. You can make more elaborate detectors. This is one way to go about doing dual energy, where essentially you have two layers, one behind the other. And you can get two measures along that line of response of the average beam energy. As you'll notice, it's not doing it event by event. And things like this that operate statistically rather than event by event don't have the same signal noise contrast for doing dual energy. So that's, we'll come back to that dual energy. So, okay, so that's all a long way of talking about analytic reconstruction. Analytic reconstruction was where you traditionally said, okay, I'm just going to invert this. This line of response is, well, I'm going to use filter back projection and map that way. Now, model-based, you're using a forward projector, where you go from your model, from the source to the projection space. You say you think you know what the projection space data should be on average, and then it's going to have, statistical fluctuations, it's going to have electronic noise, and then it can also have background. So basically, you're making a model of the whole system and other effects like dead time losses. You can build all kinds of things into these models, but the ultimate in what's, from a deep learning perspective, they're the ultimate what you call hand tooling or hand crafting, excuse me. So this is a painstakingly, matching or lovingly matching your device characteristics to the model, and spending a whole lot of compute power on doing it. And so the time to actually execute one of these models can get large. And, one form model can take as a Monte Carlo, which is clearly going to take a little while to execute to say what it would say is going to be response. So, but you don't use Monte Carlo in iterative model-based reconstruction. You have a essentially parametrized response, which is your system response matrix. You have the geometry, which is going to map you just about as efficiently as what you were doing with filter back projection to go from the image space to the projection space. But then you have to go through and do this update. So you have to, each iteration step, go from the source to the projections, from the projections, the difference between the projections, what projections would have been given what your current estimate is of the source, and you update the source and go around and around, do a bunch of iterations. So computationally, you're accessing the whole system matrix. There's a bunch of computationally costly things, but that's what you do for iterative reconstruction, and the advantages you get is it makes a lot of your artifacts go away. The better the model, you can also help you with things like basically in painting, which means you're going to introduce what you would have seen in these elements where it's been corrupted by things like metal artifact and whatnot, or other things to try and make it. Now, you need to be careful when you start using some of that stuff on motion correction, because you make something that's inconsistent. But if it's just lost data where you're filling out the rest of the sinogram with what it would have been from ideal data, then you see the analytic thing would be saying, okay, what would the ideal data look like? Whereas the model-based ideally wants to say, okay, given everything I know about the system, I should expect there to be a hole in the data over there, or I would expect the data to be softened, or it becomes like a calibration throughout the whole system. So that's your model-based. You can add noise. You have statistical weights, and what it does is it cleans things up. Particularly, you also introduce a regularizer, and the regularizer basically introduces a Bayesian term, which is saying when you're having a reconstruction, what it's trying to do is find what source distribution would have the highest likelihood of producing precisely the data that you collected. So it can overtrain on that, right? So your Bayesian term adds and says that you want the possible distribution, the distribution which is both likely to exist and to produce exactly the data you saw. So that prior knowledge term gets put into your regularizer, and you try to say that I want it to look, I don't want it to have the speckling. So that's how you keep it from overconversion with the regularizer term. But when you do that, you want to be careful what you're doing to your spatial resolution and your modulation transfer function. So there has been a whole lot of development of very sophisticated mathematical methods, which are, as I say, the ultimate in handcrafting. And then along comes machine learning. What does machine learning do and artificial intelligence do to it? Well, it holds out the prospect of saying that in the far future, it might be the case you could just have your CT scanner learn its reconstruction algorithm and not have to code anything. Now that's, we'll come back to why that's, well, we'll come back to that issue in a moment. But so let's just say for right now, you're a little ways away from that, and you're using your model. We'll see what it means. But let's look for a moment at how the deep learning is being sold. So GE is saying low dose was the benchmark for image quality, right? And then they said they used iterative image reconstruction to lower dose by 50%. And they said, but it didn't have the right texture, right? They said, what's the right texture? The texture is the way it used to be when you had really high signal noise. Now, that's not totally true because it still had some artifacts and whatnot. But that's what there's, at some point you have to please the customer on these things, right? They have to market these things. So we're sort of on the cusp between, okay, can you measure that you've got quantitatively superior performance from these algorithms? But for some cases you can, but the cutting edge is when you have low contrast lesions and which performances you're doing on that. So you need to be careful, but people are careful. And you're starting to get some evidence that there are specific, beyond just making pleasing images, that you're making more accurate images, which are better for the clinical task at hand. So that's your real challenge. So what do data-driven measurements try to do? Well, you start from your data in your projection space, and you try to imagine in an extreme version of this, that you had the outer product of the projection space and the image space. The outer product of those is, say, given any image or any projection space data set, what's the best image for that, period? It presumes there is one, okay? So there's a best image that would have produced that. And so this becomes sort of a calculation efficiency for how to estimate that. And so these things were developed out of image processing. Well, okay, but just suffice it to say, data-driven methods for the full reconstruction would take you from the projections just through weights to an image, and take you then from the weights, it would do the reconstruction. In practice, you use it for chain elements. At the moment, that's not what people are doing yet, if they're ever going to do that. What they're doing right now is operating on, I skipped a slide, in projection space or in image space. Projection space to projection space or image space to image space. Then you're fine. Then you're using a lot of the things that have been developed for the image, the original functions that these data-driven methods were developed for. So the deep learning reconstruction, first one to show up in CT, which is only just a couple of years ago, came out of Canon, which used to be Toshiba. And this is an image space one. So essentially you are getting a better texture by just operating on the images on the left, or excuse me, getting, well, I should be careful about precisely what I say about this, but it was not trying to do the full reconstruction. It was operating on reconstructed images, not necessarily the type of reconstructed image on the left, but operating on a reconstructed image and then trying to make a better reconstructed image out of that, so image to image. But what's happening, so this reference I give you there at the bottom of the page, 174-page reference, is actually pretty nice. It talks about all the mathematics of all the stuff I've only been skating by here in real brief summary of everything that's been done for all the reconstruction methods up to now, and then how that extends to the deep learning. The idea is that you're most likely to see a combination of model and data-driven approaches. So I wouldn't expect any time soon to see model-based approaches or things where you are doing what's called handcrafting to be entirely replaced by data. That's a bit of a pipe dream at the moment, and it's not clear that it's optimal. So at any rate, so the big distinction between how you're using the deep learning is whether you're going to use it, as I say on the top, image to image, where you can train your network on low quality input data. Now, low quality input data for CTs, if that's just dose reduced data, well, that's great, because you have an excellent way to make your pair. You want to have a pairs for your training where you say, okay, what would this have like to have been, as opposed to what you had here, and train it to try and make it more like that, and increase the difference. And basically, your network training is going to accomplish that. So the idea is that your low dose speckles up, and you don't want that speckling. You want it to look less speckly the way it used to. So we'll find the one that looks most like that. Which high dose image would it look most like? It finds the correspondence because you gave it one to match it up with, and it's perfectly matched. You can make it from the same data set. So these are opportunities. That's not the only way you're going to use it for image to image, but it's an instance where you have a real nice pair for your training and your what you're trying to get from low dose going to the high dose. And that's why it was what they call low hanging fruit. It was one of the first ones that was actually done, and it's been effective. So for dose reduction, you can just stay in the image space. To do the full reconstruction, you're going to need to do something like on the bottom, where your neural net's operating on the sinogram data, or phanogram, however you want to call it. I recommend to you this particular review article. It's just a few months ago, which summarizes the deep learning's impact. I'm basically just summarizing the material. Here from that, the idea is they have their four varieties we talked about before. Filter back projection at the left, upper left quadrant number one, speckles up and makes streaks. Also metal artifacts, nasty. You can have other things which will have to do with even helical artifacts show up still a little bit, and motion artifacts or something else again. Now the second one there is what he calls a hybrid iterative reconstruction. This is a glorified version of the filter back projection, which has just been iterated on, which you can do fast. So it's a fast calculation thing that still improves. This upper right, that's sort of the standard. Most machines are going to be doing that. Going all the way to doing model-based iterative reconstruction like lower left is too computationally demanding to be commonly used. So at present, that's the state. And the hope is then that with the deep learning, you're going to be having the computational speed of a neural net with the quality image that you can get, or better. Better being defined as it has the texture people prefer. What you ended up with the model-based image reconstruction is the modeling texture. The modeling comes about ultimately, can often come around from your statistical noise, your actual quantum noise in the number of X-rays detected along that line of response. That's what your regularizers keep adding. But okay, anyway, these neural nets all came about from developments in machine vision, and part of that made this schematic that you'll see again and again. That's the UNet, which is a particular type of convolutional neural net, which you can get. And the way you get one of these is, well, you make them in software, you make them on a GPU. You get the code that's going to basically implement this in the GPU's CUDA code, and both for training it and then for operating with it. And these things are your TensorFlow and the rest of these tools that are commonly available for having these things available for run them wherever you want. So again, more references and all this stuff, huge literature on all this. So it's the case that you also can use these neural nets to operate on the images and do what they were originally set up for, which is image classification, and find things. So there's many things, both for classification, segmentation, and reconstruction. So neural nets are sweeping the field. There's all kinds of recent lots of work and exciting results last couple of years. It's exploding. So here's an instance of from last year, X-ray CT, where this illustrates where you've got essentially going from the forward projection from the image domain to the projection space. The radon transform and inverse radon transform, supported by fast Fourier transforms, are really computationally efficient. So it's a practical matter. Fine for having your neural net for going from a sinogram to a better sinogram, but using it to actually go from the image to do the forward projection and do the back projections, you can do it barely. It takes huge amounts of memory, and people are jumping through all kinds of hoops to try and do it. But at the moment, it's not as practical at all than operating just in the image space or in the projection space with your neural net. And the neural nets, the ones people like, I like this particular image because of its dimensionality, all that stuff's on the inside. But you can read all about them, I'm sure you all have. But this is another instance of that, where this is a group just this year where doing CT, where they, in order to do the forward projection, they still did it using nets, but not normal nets. They had to, it's not supported by the TensorFlow. They had to make their own device in the software, but they could do it. So yeah, it may be just as, then it becomes a computational efficiency. It's also the case that there's been stuff published recently, last couple of years, where you essentially support anything you can put in a model-based reconstruction in nets, which then, depending on your computational efficiencies, that can win. That's complicated. It's not necessarily to say that that's the only way people do that. So there's a lot of people trying to do real reconstruction end-to-end. Academically, I suspect that for the commercial systems, you can see a lot more of the segmented image change stuff like this. But okay. So that being said, are we supposed to have the, okay, rather than the break, I'm going to charge ahead. What are we going to do, Moses? What do you think?
I think you can feel free to charge ahead.
Okay, I'm going to charge ahead. So we just hit the part where we went through most of, okay, everything up to dual energy. So this is dual energy essentially does not, it can be done many different ways. But what you're effectively doing is picking up on the fact that there's two processes for the X-rays to interact with material. There's the photocapture and there's the Compton scattering. And so essentially, you can tell the difference. Okay, this is the absorption spectrum for different materials with different Z, where you've got calcium intermediate between iodine, which is your red one with the K edge on it, and water down at the bottom. So the idea is that the essentially the change in the attenuation with coefficient with energy, it makes a bigger difference with the higher disease. That's okay. Sorry about that. I didn't quite get my narrative going there, though I had intended. But let's just come back here for a moment and say that the difference between, why am I in photon counting? Sorry, this slide is out of sequence, but we'll come back to this. This is a paper that we're returning to for when we talk about photon counting. or instead of having the X-ray photon converting in the scintillator, we're going to have direct conversion in usually a semiconductor, which generates a charge cloud, which you're then going to collect. So this is, and you're trying to do that single photon at a time. We'll come back to that. Okay, this basis material composition. This is what I was trying to get to. The idea is that you can make a basis of your source as your attenuating material as if it was composed. Any absorption by any material can be made up as a combination of two basis materials. What does that mean? Well, what it basically means is that you've got, for any given material, you've got, with a given density, it's got an electron density, right? So that electron density is going to determine what's going to happen in terms of Compton scattering, period. Because Compton scattering is X-rays scattering off of free electrons. It doesn't care, you know, what atom they're associated with. And the other thing that you have is photocaptures. And photocaptures, the energy dependence is the same. It's basically just how they are more strongly photocapturing, but their dependence on the X-ray energy is about the same. So to that extent, all you're saying is what's your spatial density of photocapturers and of Compton scatterers. And so you can reproduce that desired density of each of those two if you can tune the abundance of the material and its Z. So you can replace any material by a pair or the other way around. So that's what basis material decomposition sort of means. And what that gets used for in practice in dual energy is you can treat something as, if you really do have two materials, you can say, okay, I get an image of calcium, I get an image of, but it's beyond its utility, and the math gets sort of weird looking and confusing. There's a simpler way to think about it. The simpler way to think about it is, think of a virtual system. A virtual system would have two monoenergetic X-ray beams. You can make something equivalent to that, where essentially every line by line projection space element of the CT gets replaced by a different line. Okay, but there's a number of ways to mathematically form basis functions, but and you can transform from one to another. They're all equivalent. They're just basis functions, right? And so now you have issues of what's going to be calculationally preferable, more stable and things. But in terms of the means of the distributions, they're all equivalent. So monoenergetic images can be used to make basis reconstructed images or vice versa. So, and GE picked up on this pretty early, where essentially they supported having monochromatic images, they called it. And these are now, again, principal reconstructions. They can be quantitatively accurate in principle now, presuming that you've done all the things right with your scatter correction and everything else. But that's something that can never be said of a single energy. And that's helpful, well, for your reconstruction down the line, particularly for your quantitation. But the idea is it's also useful to have these other types of images for practical purposes, where you can say, okay, where's your iodine, where's your water? What would it look like if you had not done a contrast injection on somebody you just did do a contrast injection on? That type of stuff. So there's a number of things you do with dual energy that you cannot do otherwise, but it takes a fancier machine. So it hasn't exactly taken off where everybody's doing everything on dual energy. It's not likely to do that. As usual with CT, people don't sweat the quantitation quite to the same degree. They'll take their approximations, just give you resolution of small features. So dual energy has special uses, but it's sort of some, they're pushing, there's different ways to do it. You can have fast KVP switching. You can have two different X-ray sources. That's pushing one of the problem. Then you have to worry about whether or not your phanograms actually line up, because the patient can move between the two. Another bunch of things when you're trying to match up these two. That's why GE did their modulation, trying to make sure they match. That's why Philips did their, two detectors line up on top of one another, make sure they match. But you always have this issue that you get more contrast for dual energy when you have less overlap with the spectra. So there are better ways to get more dual energy contrast than others. And these things each have pads behind them, so they compete in this. But again, dual energy, this way of doing it has not been earth-shattering in its impact. When it's combined with photon counting, which will be in the future, it probably is going to make a resurgence. We'll come back to that. So the other thing you can do when you have the energy bins, if you have multiple energy bins, you can pick up K-edges in principle. So before we said that it only you only have dual energy, and you can make anything out of two materials because there's only two physics processes that underlying it as a substrate, photocapture and Compton. If you have a different kind of photocapture where you're below the K-edge, then that's a third basis function. So essentially you can separate out a third material. And again, how well you can do this, your signal noise depends on your contrast, the way you go about doing it. But ideally, yeah, if you had, there's two ways to do energy dependent. You can have where you're modulating the beam, modulating the detection efficiency, or you can measure the actual energies of the photons. And when you measure the actual energy of photons, you can start to imagine doing this type of stuff where you have more information on the materials and special information bearing on particular materials you can put in the field of view, which can have K edges at useful energies like gold. So there's a bunch of stuff there, but it's specialized, not widely out there like the rest of the CT stuff. Now, digital CT, people have been working on for a while. They'll continue working on for a while. And one of these days, there's going to be a breakthrough, and they're just going to sweep the field, not right away. But the problem is that the flux of X-ray photons from a CT source at the moment is too high for photon counting to be other than really difficult and expensive. But technology continues to improve, and people are innovative about how to go about doing this. But here's where we stand at the moment, or close to the moment, for direct conversion, single photon counting. Direct conversion you can have anyway without having single photon counting, but we'll talk about it in the case where you do have single photon counting. So you worry about pileup, where you have two events at the same time. You're trying to get, you're trying to measure your photon counting rate. You make an error when you do that. You also have crosstalk, which is unpleasant. So all these real world effects need to be built into your system response model. And here we are hand tuning again. Now, could you use a net there? Yes. Have people done that? Yes. Is that new? Yes, this year. So that's, you know, you'll see more development along those lines. The basic thing you're trying to get for your photon counting detector is one of two things. If it's energy sensitive, then you're trying to do some dual energy stuff and get some. There's also, if you're not, you can get statistical improvement just from the fact, oh, where's my slide on that? There should be a slide. Sorry, what I meant to have a slide on this is saying that with energy integrating electronics, you weight the higher energy photons more than the lower energy ones, just because they're bigger. And so that's the wrong kind of weighting. You want to have them have equal weights statistically. So it's, if you can access them individually in individual channels, you can increase the signal noise just from the photon counts. And if that's what's limiting your image quality, well, you can improve your image quality. So this is what I'm talking about, the X-ray photon counting through data. That was the work that I was referring to, and again, that's just a few months old. There it is, sorry. The photon counting enables energy bin weighting. This is how you get the improvement in the contrast noise ratio by including the energy information. So this is a modest improvement in signal noise, but it's real, okay? And so none of these things should be expected to be as huge a difference as introducing deep learning where you didn't have deep learning before. These are incremental improvements. Going to photon counting for now, first, when you get that, we'll get to the advantages of photon counting. I have a slide on that in a moment. So K-edges, we talked a little bit about that, how you can do the K-edge imaging. Multi-material K-edge imaging, again, this is, if you have the multiple energy, you can separate out multiple contrast agents, which would be nice. And calcium at the same time, so you can see your contrast ejection. Okay, this is the slide I was looking for. So what are the advantages, potential advantages for photon counting in CT? Well, higher spatial resolution, smaller pixels. Spatial resolution is nice, okay? And then signal to noise, fine. And swung factor, okay, again, the spectral information comes at the bottom of the list. So there has not yet been the type of killer app for dual energy that's made it to where, man, we better have the best dual energy you could ever have. And you don't have some of those other applications for the multiple. Those are all speculative, but we'll see. We'll see where this goes. But it scientifically or mathematically, as it were, it'd be nice if the one that's actually principled was useful, but whatever. Okay, that, please, for heaven's sake, I'm going to have extra time because I've made it to 15 minutes before and I hit the protons. So I'll throw protons at you guys, because we ran into it with the time. This is another form of transmission tomography. I've worked on this some, where this is measuring when you're doing proton therapy. Well, I'm going to throw this open to the crowd. Moses, can you help me do this?
Sure.
Which would you rather do, hear about protons or get some more questions about what we already talked about for the regular CT? Any questions about any of the slides? I'd sort of like.
Well, I've got a question that's it's sort of come up before when we've talked about the difference between iterative and analytic reconstruction in PET, and discussing how, you know, there's been a move towards reducing dose in combination with iterative reconstruction in CT. And, you know, you're talking even farther about going on
Deep learning.
By deep learning based reconstruction. Now, speaking anecdotally on my behalf, I've known MDs and clinicians who look at iteratively constructed CTs and sort of don't trust it because they think it looks too good or it looks fake. And have you seen anecdotally anything along the same lines from their response to deep learning based reconstruction images?
No, sort of the reverse. The deep learning ones have succeeded in popular mind, or people using it, at overcoming that. In other words, the model-based were looking unnatural, didn't have the texture that people were familiar with. So the deep learning is intentionally, certainly for CT, reproducing the classic look of a high-dose image by pairing it with a high-dose image.
Okay.
So basically, you have the same acquisition. You can take the data and truncate it. Imagine it came in list mode. You could do literally that. You could basically, and you can do the equivalent, where you could, well, one way to do it is to just do another scan with a higher dose this time around. Another way to do it is to model what's going on a little bit. Well, okay, there's a number of, but the basic idea is either this a real high dose scan that you're matching it with, or you can simulate it up in what's called data augmentation. So either way, the thing that you're trying to, you can make a synthetic image, particularly if you forward project this with a good model, that will look like the reconstructed image that you make from it. So when you do that, you can make it as if it had higher statistics. And then you'll produce, it'll still be having the noise, but it'll have the right texture for the noise. So you prefer to do that with real data, but there's other tricks you can do. And for PET, since you brought up PET, you got the natural thing there where you do get list mode data and you just use a fraction of it. You know, that is your dose reduced, and then you have perfect matching because it's every nth event. You don't quite have that with CT, but it's getting close. And, you know, you can, if it comes down to it, you know, do a second scan, presuming you haven't had any motion in between the two. So as long as the patient says it still is a phantom, you're all set.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Sure. Can we hear from anybody in the audience? Anybody not asleep?
Oh, well, actually, I also have a question. So in our cardiac CT studies, not for every animal we were scanning, but for some of them we were observing those streak artifacts. And a colleague of us was referring to them as metal artifacts, as you were also doing. So another colleague and I, we started discussing like where they would come from, since we wouldn't know where there would be any metal. But what I understood now, metal artifact doesn't necessarily mean that there's actually metal in the subject. Is this correct?
Well, the way metal artifact works is there's two things: metal artifact per se and what's called starvation artifact. So just the total amount of attenuation. What the biggest source of artifact for that is when you have two pieces of metal in the field of view. Then it really kills the line of response. It starves it down to nothing. But the one thing that's actually one place where dual energy can be useful is to be resistant against the metal artifact. The metal artifact correction algorithms do things like taking your sinogram and it'll have a hole in it because where the metal was, there's starvation. Or it will have the wrong CT value because the Z of the metal is way different than water. Okay, so you get a combination of two. The being different from water is metal artifact per se, but a lot of times what gets called metal artifact will be starvation in the presence of metal. And starvation just means that your value that you measured along that CT line of response is comparable to electronic noise or zero. So in other words, that's what you're taking the logarithm of, and it just got unreliable, you see, because let's say that you've got 1 million photons per line of response per integration interval, okay, as you're sweeping around. So if there's 1 million of them, and then you have a 10 to the 6 attenuation on a particular line of response, you just got one, okay, and you can't see one X-ray reliably compared to electronic noise. So that effectively means that you've got you've got starvation. That's photon starvation. Now you normally, if you had like 100 of them, you take the ratio of 100 to the million, and you take the logarithm of that. That's your signal, right? That's your attenuation signal along that line of response. And that's the thing that when you take the logarithm of the thing which is zero, that blows up. So zero or at the level of electronic noise, either way, that's your photon starvation. That's photon starvation. The way you try and fix that is you repair the sinogram. You repair the sinogram by saying, okay, I don't like that there. Let me put something there that would be normal, like an extension is in painting. Say, let me blank out that part of them. Let guess what might have been there from extension, what's around it. And oh, by the way, let me forward project and back project to in paint there. So there's a whole developed methodology for doing that, a very handcrafted thing for doing metal artifact correction, and it works to different degrees. That's an opportunity for deep learning, because essentially what deep learning would like to do in that regard is say, here's a image where you don't have metal artifact, here's one where you do, train it on that, and let it try and fix it. Again, synthetic images are very likely to do the training on that. The development of synthetic images and then data augmentation have enough images to do the training in your sets. But I'm sorry, is that even close to an answer to your question, or you want to do a follow-up?
No, that sounds good. That makes sense. Thank you.
No, metal artifact, you see, when I worked on a dual energy machine, that was, again, one of the nice things with it being principled. If you have a principled reconstruction, well, you'll still end up eventually running into photon starvation, but your model base should at least predict that it should be zero. See, the streaks are coming from something like filtered back projection, where it just, you see, you've got one of two things. Analytic reconstruction, you're trying to make as if data. What would the sinogram have looked like if there was no metal artifact? Okay, whereas the iterative reconstruction can say, okay, there is metal there, it's supposed to go to zero, and it did that. Fine, we're all set. See, it's trying to do the residual minimization in the presence of things that can, it's fine if it drives it to zero and has a shadow there, okay? So your streaks that you're seeing first, big time, are often because you're stuck still with filter back projection for computational reasons. You don't have enough time to compute to do the iterative. Sometimes the iterative will start with the filter back projection as initial guess anyway. So in either of those cases, any filter back projection stuff around is going to want to streak, because you've got a ramp filter, right? So any imperfections, you amplify the high frequency part of it, and it all goes along that particular line of response. Yeah, you know, that's where your mismatch is. All those things are based on the fact that you lied to filter back projection by telling it you had infinite statistics and perfect data, which you didn't. Okay, so when that's no longer the case, you've given it something to do an inverse radon transform that was never a radon transform with anything. So it responds by giving you a streak. So there's no such analytic solution. So whereas the model-based can improve on it, but at the cost of a lot of handwork and working differently one time to the next if you're not careful. So that's where your hope is with the machine learning, is it's going to be more robust against that, more supportable and faster. So all of these things, there's a lot of potential for metal artifact reduction, and then you'll find papers on it. So again, all this stuff is so new that, you know, within the last year or two, you'll see the first big paper on, you know, metal artifact reduction by, you know, neural depths, and it's pretty good. So it's nice to see that. You know, I've been in this area for decades, and this last couple of years has been dramatic.
Yes, this sounds good. And you just mentioned also the dual energy CT could be used as well for reducing metal artifacts. So then would you apply this on the rotate?
There's a huge signal in dual energy for where there is metal. And you can, again, unless you're in the fully starved state, you can recover. Okay? You get a signal as to what the Z is of the metal, depending on whether you're fully starved or not. But again, even if you are getting towards starved, in the edges, you'll be less starved. So everything gets better, right? And the starved lines of response require in-painting. It's preferable to not do in painting if you can avoid it. In-painting is a branch of, you know, limited angle, basically. You know, and so anything like that is less robust. So, but if that's what you've got in your data, that's what you've got in your data. So but dual energy does help a lot with metal artifact. Again, there's a good literature on that.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Good. Anybody else? Let's hear from somebody else. If you can, please. I'm asking. Because there's no time for protons. Sorry. Oh, hell. I'll throw protons at you. Nobody's going to say anything. Here's protons. You know, at the end, right? Okay, so here's the idea with protons, right? Protons, you're trying to deliver a beam that stops at the end of the path. Because unlike electrons, or excuse me, unlike X-rays, which are exponentially attenuated, protons are going through multiple scattering, having DEDX with the ionizing as you go through until the very end. So you intentionally have a beam of protons which are all the same energy, so they stop at the same distance in. You get what's called a Bragg peak. So you're basically making a knife that cuts on the end. And in order to make it cut at the right place, you need to make it stop at the right place, which means there's concern about where you're actually delivering your protons. And particularly if, you know, the CT changes the way, you'd like to have a way to see where you're actually delivering your protons, because it can be moved around by things like the patient's anatomy changing. Other things can make sources of uncertainty. There are lots of them. And this is radiation oncology, so you're doing your damnedest to reduce your margins and know exactly where everything's going on. So you'd like to have feedback as to where the protons are going. So this was some work we did a couple of years ago, and it's still ongoing, but I'm waiting for the detectors to get a little bit better and get back in the beam. The idea is that protons used in radiation therapy are subrelativistic. It means if you have a set of protons all with the same kinetic energy, they all have the same velocity. And if you happen to have sensors which are light speed sensors, and we're working on these things called large area picosecond photon detectors, and they're used for time of flight measurements like for time of flight PET. So when you put one of those in the proton beam, you should be able to see the proton bunches. Basically, you change the energy of the beam, you should see the velocity change. You should see basically a pair of such paddles, you can do time flight measurement of protons. So we did a little bit of that. The challenge is that the flux is high, right? Higher than you think. And so you need to have some rate capability in your sensors. And so we're still working on it, but the idea is that you would have the coordinate for where the proton went through on the one upstream and the downstream. When we did this in the actual beam at MGH, we were too early in the development. We only had one of the two LPPDs working right. And this was a couple of years ago. Now we're on like number 69. Back then we were like number 15 or something. So it looks like this had to build a system that we put in the proton beam with that's got a pair of the detectors. That's me peeking at you. Okay, that's LPPD 15, like I said. And it almost sort of kind of worked, and that's the end. But okay, our final slide for wrapping up on time. What will the future bring? Well, we're going to see image reconstruction improvement. We're going to see deep learning make a big difference in reconstruction, just because it will. Even though it's going to be around the edges, mostly for lower dose, you'll have a bigger impact on speed. And the quality, the speed that the speed with which you can get a good image from a low dose will be helped a lot by that. That'll push it into the mainstream. And image processing with the eye, that's going to be huge. It already is growing by leaps and bounds. And so that interfaces this to the way that you use the images. So there's a bunch of stuff coming there. Clinical photon counting CT, they're going to keep getting better. It's not going to be overnight. That's a new material, new technology. It takes time and it's challenging. The flux is high. So the rate at which you get the pulses and the size requirement, basically it means you combat the flux by having small individual detector elements. It gets microscopic on you, it gets complex, but people are doing it. People are doing it. You'll see it eventually. Give it a decade. Multi-energy photon counting CT, yeah, similar. Proton radiography and proton CT, well, maybe longer, but whatever. Proton CT has been proposed for a long time. Pulse and distributed X-ray sources, well, that would be nice. See, there's a whole other X-ray interaction mechanism, which is coherent scattering. And so all these sources we've seen are continuous over time. If you had a pulse source, you can start to do some nice things. You just get toward the fourth generation things where you have distributed sources, distributed time. You can start to do compressed sensing things like you do for MRI and CT. You say, oh, you can never do that in CT. You can't choose your sequence because the thing's spinning around. Well, if you're virtually spinning by having it excite the X-rays at different places on your source or distribute around, then it's different. That's all very speculative and exotic, but that's what the future is for. So thank you all.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Before everybody